Okay, well, welcome. This is the fourth of a series of 4 lectures and discussions on the Jewish exile. I will just begin by doing a little review of some of the things we've covered in the last couple of weeks. From my perception, in my study at least, I see 10 major changes in Judaism during the period immediately before the exile, during the exile, and then immediately after the exile. The 10 changes, just to recapitulate real quickly, is that the Torah, the scripture, Hebrew scriptures, goes from being a rather loose collection of scrolls into a rather comprehensive document, and it also changes its status from just, I think, a veneration of old documents to actually a central part of the worship, as we know it is today in Judaism. So the Torah reaches its final state about 400 BCE, but it brings in a whole number of documents that have been written during the 150 years before that. A second thing is the Sabbath takes on a new importance in Judaism, and there seems to be some ambiguity here whether this is still a monthly Sabbath, the first of the new moon, or whether it is a weekly Saturday type of occurrence. Regardless of what the occurrence is, it is still a very central part of Judaism at this time, and one thing that sets Jews apart from non-Jews. The worship, the big change there is from the temple to something, and that something we think was kind of an early form of the synagogue, which was probably meetings in homes or in public buildings. Eventually, there were some dedicated structures. The oldest one we have of those dedicated structures in the Holy Land is from the time of Herod, but that's not to say that there weren't many before that. A fourth change is in leadership, where the priest was in many ways the central figure in worship, and in leadership of the community. We have the rise now of the rabbis, which began probably as neighborhood and community teachers, and the scribes, who are the legal and biblical scholars, which take on an increased importance. In addition to those changes, there are 3 doctrines, if you want to call them clusters of belief, that grow up during this period. And one of those is the idea of a Messiah, a figure from history that will change the course of history. The idea of a final judgment, which we find very little in the Hebrew teachings before that, and then the idea of a general resurrection. Then I'm suggesting that there are at least 3 major changes that happened in the understanding of covenant. The first being that the covenant is no longer a bargaining between the people and God, but it is a unilateral gift of God. Secondly, that the kingdom of God becomes a universal thing rather than simply a tribal religion of the Jews. And then finally, that the collective view of religion and of salvation, the collective view moves more to a personal faith, and also, in a sense, from a tribal faith to a more family-centered religion. So those are all major changes that take place in Judaism during this period. Now, there may have been others. There is a language shift, for instance, from Hebrew as a major spoken language to Aramaic, which becomes, at that time, pretty much a universal language. Hebrew remains the religious language, and so almost all of the Hebrew scriptures are written in Hebrew, though there are some sections in Aramaic. Religious structure we don't know much about, but again, something evolved probably of a kind of religious community within the villages and small towns and probably within neighborhoods of Jerusalem. There may even have been some growth of something we might call democracy, but we don't really have much proof of that. Little change in other things like the purity laws and the modes of dress and what archaeologists love to call the material culture, what kind of pots and pans you use. There doesn't seem to be any change, particularly during this period. So let's talk about the return. And the return begins in the year 538 BCE, when Cyrus, having pretty much taken Babylon without a fight, those who were waiting for the destruction of Babylon, it never quite happened at this time. The Persians and the Medes just sort of marched in and took over. So, beginning with Cyrus's edict to restore the various captives people to their homeland, it wasn't just the Hebrews, there was other groups involved as well. But a group starts moving back to Jerusalem. And according to the book of Ezra, the whole company numbered 42,360. Always very suspicious of precise numbers like that. I think the person who wrote the book of Ezra sort of started listing all the people one by one, because there's a whole bunch of names in there that don't mean anything to us at all. But in addition to the 42,000, there were also about 7,000 male and female slaves. And then there are 200 male and female singers. I don't know how you end up with humans, slaves, and singers. This seems like a kind of an odd category. But anyway, that's what the book of Ezra says. They also had 736 horses, a bunch of mules, 435 camels, and over 6,000 donkeys. Now, the figure of 50,000, counting all the free people, the slaves, and the singers, seems a fairly reasonable number if you consider that there probably was considerable population growth among the community while in Babylon. Ezra does not say anything about those that stayed in Babylon. And again, the estimates are fairly wild on this, but the thought is that probably a good 1,000 or more stayed in Babylon. I think we can also expect that despite the fact that the book of Ezra sounds like they all marched across the desert in one group, this was probably a gradual return that took a couple years to take place. Now, the key figure in reestablishing Jerusalem as a safe city and a place of worship is a man by the name of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is a nice Babylonian name, but the assumption is, based upon his history, is that he probably was Jewish. And he is appointed as the governor over this territory. Actually, there is a person named Sheshbazzar who shows up first as the governor and then disappears completely from the record, never shows up again. So historians have kind of assumed that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel were probably the same person, just two different names. The other major leader was a man by the name of Joshua, who was the high priest for most of this period, actually. And under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, the altar was rebuilt, sacrifices were resumed, the first of the great feasts, the Feast of Tabernacles, was held, and regular worship services, Sabbath services started at the new moon. Nothing at this point about the weekly worship. They brought in masons and carpenters from the Lebanese cities of Sidon and Tyre and started rebuilding the temple. The Levites were supervising the building of the temple, though they still could not preside at the worship services. So this is the beginning of, I mentioned, I think last time, Ezekiel wrote about what he called the apostasy of the Levites. And so you have conflict that continues down once the return has taken place of the Levites and the Zadokites, which the Zadokites are actually a subset of the Levites, but it's a hereditary subset. And so the priesthood is handed down from father to son and so forth, which is the way it still continued at the time of Jesus, except by the time of Jesus, there were several families that were contending for the high priesthood, and you may remember stories about the very simple way of electing a priest. The high priest or the chief priest was who could bribe the Romans with the largest amount of money, which was a very effective election system. At this point, I don't see that there was any of that kind of carryings on. Anyway, the Zadokites have consolidated power, both political and religious power, during the period after the return. And while there is no direct connection between the Levites and the Zadokites on the one hand and the Pharisees and the Sadducees on the other, I think that kind of division of religious authority continues, and then it shows up about 300 years later with first the development of the Sadducees and then of the Pharisee movement. Now, the laying of the foundation of the temple was celebrated, and there was some opposition to building the temple. And it's not quite clear whether these were the Jews that had stayed in Judea, or whether it was the Samaritans who were causing trouble. Regardless of which group was opposing the temple, it got delayed for a while, and it seems like the biggest obstacle was simply the bureaucracy of the Persian government at this point. They couldn't quite decide what to allow the Jews to do. But nevertheless, what's called the Second Temple was finally completed and dedicated. There's some difficulty here with the dating, but either 517 or 516. And at this point, Cyrus was no longer the emperor. He had died, and Darius was the emperor. Now, they sent a governor by the name of Nehemiah, and this is where things get very muddled, because it's not clear, just from reading the biblical accounts, whether Nehemiah is part of this original building project or whether he comes much later. As I say, we just don't know. Now, this time of the return from the exile, we have three major prophets again that are come to prominence. And the first of them, the three prophets are another prophet named Isaiah, which is usually called Third Isaiah, and then the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. Now, Third Isaiah, we virtually know nothing about the person, other than he seems to have been active around the year between 520 and 500, so within a few years after the return from the exile. Probably, if you compare him with Second Isaiah, he comes like one or two generations after Second Isaiah. Now, Isaiah, a good part of the book of Isaiah is taken over to some very negative observations of what is going on in this country after the return from the exile. So let me read a couple passages from Isaiah. Isaiah says this in chapter 64, "Your sacred cities have become a wasteland. Even Zion is a wasteland, Jerusalem a desolation. Our holy and glorious temple where our ancestors praised you has been burned with fire, and all that we treasured lies in ruins." Remember again, Isaiah is talking about after the exile. So this is not the destruction of Jerusalem, which is what Second Isaiah wrote about. Talking about the leadership of the Judean government and religion at this point, Isaiah in chapter 56 says, Israel's watchmen are blind. They all lack knowledge. They are all mute dogs. They cannot bark. They lie around and dream. They love to sleep. Sounds like watchmen generally. They are dogs with mighty appetites. They never have enough. They are shepherds who lack understanding. They all turn to their own way. They seek their own gain. Come, each one cries, let us get wine. Let us drink our fill of beer. And tomorrow will be like today, or even far better. Not a lot of confidence in the guardians of the city there. Now the festivals, beginning again with the one mentioned in Ezra, had continued, but Isaiah is not very, what should we say, complimentary of them. When we call them fasts, I think he's really talking about festivals. And a festival typically started with a fast and then ended up with a big party. To this day, that's the pattern. Even among the Muslims, you have fasting, and then you have a great party at the end of it. So anyway, this is what Isaiah has to say. Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. Wild party. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. So Isaiah very much has moral objections to the way the religion is being carried on in his country. And I think this is my last passage on Isaiah on the current state of society. But your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. For your hands are stained with blood, your fingers with guilt. Your lips have spoken falsely, and your tongue mutters wicked things. No one calls for justice. No one pleads a case with integrity. They rely on empty arguments. They utter lies. They conceive trouble and give birth to evil. I know I shouldn't say this, but it sounds like Rudy Giuliani to me. They hatch the eggs of vipers and spin a spider's web. Whoever eats their eggs will die, and when one is broken, an adder is hatched. Their cobwebs are useless for clothing. They cannot cover themselves with what they make. Their deeds are evil deeds, and acts of violence are in their hands. Their feet rush into sin. They are swift to shed innocent blood. They pursue evil schemes, acts of violence mark their ways. The way of peace they do not know. There is no justice in their paths. They have turned them into crooked roads. No one who walks along them will know peace. So justice is far from us, and righteousness does not reach us. We look for light, but all is darkness. For brightness, but we walk in deep shadows. Like the blind, we grope along the wall, feeling our way like people without eyes. At midday, we stumble as if it were twilight. Among the strong, we are like the dead. We all growl like bears. We moan mournfully like doves. We look for justice but find none, for deliverance, but it is far away. For our offenses are many in your sight, and our sins testify against us. Our offenses are ever with us, and we acknowledge our iniquities. Rebellion and treachery against the Lord, turning our backs on our God, inciting revolt and oppression, uttering lies our hearts have conceived. So justice is driven back and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets, honesty cannot enter. Truth is nowhere to be found, and whoever shuns evil becomes a prey. Not a pretty sight. Again, remember this is the time after the return, and it seems to be a time of conflict and lawlessness. I'm sorry, I do have one more passage from Isaiah. All day long I have held out my hands to an obstinate people who walk in ways not good, pursuing their own imaginations, a people who continually provoke me to my very face, offering sacrifices in gardens and burning incense on altars of brick, who sit among the graves and spend their nights keeping secret vigil, who eat the flesh of pigs and whose pots hold broth of impure meat, who say, "Keep away, don't come near me, for I am too sacred for you." Such people are smoke in my nostrils, a fire that keeps burning all day. See, a kind of a combination of idolatry and sacrilege going on in Judea at this time. It's interesting, I think, to note in these prophets that idolatry is not only what we think of as, made out of wood and rocks and so forth, but it is a surrender to surrender to riches and to a spirit of materialism that often is at the heart of idolatry. Nevertheless, Isaiah does have some hope for the future, and this is what he tells us. No longer will violence be heard in your land, nor ruin or destruction within your borders, but you will call your walls salvation and your gates praise. The sun will no more be your light by day, nor will the brightness of the moon shine on you, for the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Your sun will never set again, and your moon will wane no more. The Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of sorrow will end. Then all your people will be righteous, and they will possess the land forever. They are the shoot I have planted, the work of my hands, for the display of my splendor. Like all the other prophets we have talked about, we have denunciation and anger at idolatry, and then always at the very end a promise of a better future. So that's Isaiah, and I think it is not unfair to say that some of the greatest literature of the world is found in 2nd and 3rd Isaiah. Simply, there's no other word for it. It's marvelous. The next prophet we're going to take a look at is not as well known, hardly known at all, as a matter of fact, and that is the prophet Haggai. It's a short book. It's only 2 chapters, and the main theme is let's get building on the temple. The book begins this way. In the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. It is a time for you yourselves, is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? In other words, you build houses for yourselves. Why aren't you taking care of the temple? So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel and the spirit of Joshua and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty, their God. So we can actually date this book. Darius becomes the king and the emperor in 522, so this has to have been written in the year 520. The other theme, the minor theme, again, is a denunciation of defilement by cheating and dishonesty among the people. And also there's an interesting passage in which the prophet Haggai anoints Zerubbabel, the governor. So this is possibly one of the first mentions in this set of prophets of the concept of a Messiah. So that's about it for Haggai. There's not an awful lot more you can say about the book. And then the third and final prophet that I wanted to take a look at is Zechariah. Zechariah is a much more complex book, but again, we have some precise dates. We see that at least part of it was written in the year 420, and some parts of it in 418. Now, again, it's a complex book. The diction and the vocabulary seem to be different in different parts of it. And so again, with Isaiah, where we split Isaiah into first, second, and third, there's at least a first and second Zechariah. And again, there probably is a space of time here. Nobody knows what exactly, but probably a 20-year difference between the 8th chapter and the 9th chapter. Now, the book of Zechariah is particularly well known for all of its visions. And just as there are visions in the book of Ezekiel, here there are just no end of visions. There's a vision of 4 horns, a vision of 4 craftsmen, a man with a measuring line. There's a dialogue of a high priest with Satan. And then I find this one kind of interesting. There's a stone that has 7 eyes. Can't quite picture that. A flying scroll. There's a vision of 4 chariots that have 4 different colors of horses. I'm going to read 2 passages from Zechariah just to give you a kind of idea of, I just lost something here, of the kind of writing that it is. This is from the 4th chapter of Zechariah. Then the angel who talked with me returned and woke me up. Like someone awakened from sleep, he asked me, "What do you see?" I answered, "I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lamps on it, with 7 channels to the lamp. And there are 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left." I asked the angel who talked with me, "What are these, my Lord?" Some of this dialogue is a little bit dumb, but anyway. So the angel answered, "Do you not know what these are?" "No, my Lord," I replied. So he said to me, "This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. What are you, mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel you will become level ground. Then he will bring out the capstone to shouts of God bless it, God bless it." Then the word of the Lord came to me. The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this temple. His hands will also complete it. Then you will know that the Lord Almighty has sent me to you. Who dares despise the day of small things? since the 7 eyes of the Lord that range throughout the earth will rejoice when they see the chosen capstone in the hand of Zerubbabel. There's those 7 eyes again. Then I asked the angel, what are these 2 olive trees on the right and the left of the lampstand? Again I asked him, what are these 2 olive branches, besides the 2 gold pipes that pour out golden oil? He replied, do you not know what these are? No, my Lord, I said. So he said, these are the 2 who are anointed to serve the Lord of all the earth. So we have a very explicit reference to Messiah. And in this case, it appears that he's talking about the high priest and the governor. This has led many Jews throughout history to think that there will be not 1 but 2 messiahs. The idea of a dual messiahship. And there's a book that's written some years after this called The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. Didn't make it into the Bible, but the book is still around. And that actually explicitly talks about the 2 messiahs. You may remember there's also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a number of places, but especially in a place called the Damascus document, there is an explicit reference to the 2 messiahs and the role that they would play. Another story from Zechariah, and if you can figure out what this one is all about, you're doing far better than I am. Then the angel who was speaking to me came forward and said to me, look up and see what is appearing. I asked, what is it? He replied, it is a basket. And he added, this is the iniquity of the people throughout the land. Then the cover of lead was raised, and there in the basket sat a woman. He said, this is wickedness. And he pushed her back into the basket and pushed the lead cover down on it. Then I looked up, and there before me were 2 women with the wind in their wings. They had wings like those of a stork, and they lifted up the basket between heaven and earth. Where are they taking the basket? I asked the angel who was speaking to me. He replied, to the country of Babylonia to build a house for it. When the house is ready, the basket will be set there in its place. That's it. That's the story. Like I say, I have no clue as to what this is all about. Interesting imagery.
Yeah. Richard, is there any chance, Richard, that there's some overlap with like Pandora's box or something like that? I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, it does. That's a Greek legend.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, I never thought of that, Ken, but that's roughly contemporary because I think the thought is that legend is from the 5th or 6th century BCE.
I think you're right. Yeah.
So so I guess what it is a retelling of the Pandora's box story. But who these women with stork wings and why they're taking it to Babylon just isn't all clear. Nonetheless, after all of these stories and this imagery, Zechariah does have a word concerning the future, not necessarily a unambiguously good future, but this is certainly, again, an early account of what the final judgment will be. Then the Lord will appear over them. His arrow will flash like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south, and the Lord Almighty will shield them. They will destroy and overcome with sling stones. They will drink and roar as with wine. They will be full like a bowl used for sprinkling the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save his people on that day, as a shepherd saves his flock. They will sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown. How attractive and beautiful they will be, grain will make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. I'm not sure, again, what that last sentence means, but it is certainly, a vision of last things, or of the final judgment. Now, some of these visions of Zechariah are what scholars have considered kind of an early form of the apocalypticism, which I'm not going to go into. But the apocalyptic literature is several dozens of books, and the only portions that made it into the Hebrew Bible are parts of Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah. In the New Testament, there are a number of apocalyptic visions in the Gospels, but also the book of Revelation is a completely apocalyptic book. The imagery in Zechariah certainly inspired the writer of Revelation. So there are things that are copied directly out, as well as from Daniel. And I think Zechariah, as a prophet, as a book of the Hebrew Scripture, shows a further development of these Jewish changes from the exilic period. Zechariah, and you read it, every once in a while you'll see a line that looks awfully familiar, and then you realize that it's Jesus quoted from Zechariah on a number of occasions, just as he quoted from Isaiah, and Matthew, the evangelist, also used Zechariah, and also a book called Malachi. Now, Malachi is really not part of this generation. It's probably about 50 years later. But both Zechariah and Malachi had all kinds of prophecies of things that would happen, and Matthew found all kinds of ingenious ways to work them into his narrative. Now, to close up, the Persian period continues for just about exactly 200 years. And what we know about it in terms of the religious life and the political and economic life of Judea is just about zip. We have a number of books that were written during this period. And they give us a little bit of a clue, but in terms of documentation, there just is virtually nothing. Now, the books of Isaiah and a book called, I love the name of this book, Paralipomenon, which we know as Chronicles. So there are two books in the Hebrew Scriptures which become four, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, in the Christian version. Are written during the Persian period, and also the book of Esther and the book of Jonah are probably products of this period, and the what we call the E-text, the P-text, the priestly text came from this period. And then the editors, maybe the same people who wrote the priestly text, consolidated all of this into the 5 books of Moses. So there's a lot that happens from a biblical perspective in the Persian period, but we don't know much what happened with the rest of the people. Then the Persian period is followed in 330 by the Greek period, and we know just about as little about the religious life of that period. Though there's a number of books that come out of the Greek period, the book of Daniel, then the books that are in the Apocrypha, Sirach, Baruch, and Tobit are all from the Greek period. So, what can we say about the exile? In conclusion, I think there is no question, in my mind at least, that it totally transformed the Hebrew religion. In fact, historians tend to call the period before the exile the history of the Hebrews, and afterwards the Jews. It's a dividing line, a demarcation, and we've seen just in many, many aspects. It helped Judaism, I think, to survive these many changes, made them much more adaptable, even though there's some that might consider the work of Ezra to be kind of a backsliding, a retrogression. And that's a highly debated subject both among Jewish scholars and among biblical historians. What emerges from this period, I think, are a number of debates about the nature of God, the nature of faith, the nature of morality, how it relates to religion, and so forth. And I have maintained that probably the number one question from all of this period and well into the time of Jesus is, what does it mean to be a good Jew? And as we've seen, there were probably at least 40 different answers to that question. Among the answers to that question, one of them, which emerged in the first century, was to be a follower of Jesus. Mm. And so Christianity is one of those various forms of Judaism that develops into having its own religious form. Mm-hmm. I am willing to argue that without the exile, I don't know that Judaism would have survived. And if there is no Judaism, there is no Christianity and no Islam. When you look at the various religions of the world, approximately 1/2 of the 7 billion people on this planet are adherents to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, or varieties thereof.
So this is Monty. It would not have survived because it was focused on a temple, a geographical location, and it was more of a tribal religion as compared to a worldly one. I know you have a list of factors, but why would it not have survived in your mind?
Well, I think it might have survived as a tiny sect.
Yeah.
I mean, this is playing a game of what if, and it's a difficult thing. But I think that there is very little likelihood that it would have become, in a sense, a world religion and given rise to 2 other world religions. As I mentioned last time, I think that it is from this period, a bit later actually, probably in the Greek period, that Judaism becomes a missionary religion. Mm-hmm. And begins adding adherents throughout the entire Mediterranean world. I don't think that would have happened if it had not survived the exile in the form that it did. Speculation.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no proof for that, but that's sort of what makes the historical game fun. One of the great games that American historians play is what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's kind of a fruitless game, but it does keep you busy. So anyway, that's kind of where I'm ending the story at this point. I think it was a critical time for Judaism, but I think also it's a critical time for the world. That Judaism made those adaptations, that it made those expansions, both in ideas and in geography.
Yeah, I mean, I would add maybe that what emerges from the exile in Scripture and is the sense that a faithful follower of God can and actually may be more likely to suffer. That is that, you know, to endure the strife of the world, and to that's a mark of faithfulness rather than um, an indication of God's disfavor.
I think I think that's a very good point. And certainly, when we look at some of the passages of the suffering servant in Isaiah, that certainly lends a lot of support to that. But yes, I think and the first exile, is followed by a return from exile. The second exile, which is the Roman exile in the first and second century, is much more ambiguous. And I know someone would make the case that the restoration of Israel as a modern country is part of the story too. But that's going a little bit far afield, and certainly doesn't take account the Holocaust and some of the stories of persecution in the intermediate period. Well, I have to share
political stability that they were able to do all this writing, and all this literature emerges, and yet it wasn't. They never returned to the glory of David and Solomon.
Right. Right.
They were
yeah, I mean, again, some of these greatest writings took place either during the exile itself or in the chaos that followed the return. And so, I think, from a standpoint of intellectual history, it's an amazing period. Well, I have two quick stories I want to tell, since I didn't use up my full hour, and I don't intend to, but some of you may be familiar with Sir Leonard Woolley, who's a British archaeologist, and he uncovered some royal tombs in what was originally the city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. And in a way, his find was equal in importance from a historical standpoint to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, which happened around the same time. But anyway, among the things that Woolley found were a number of artifacts. And my favorite Mesopotamian artifact, and this is not a joke, there's not a punchline here. My favorite artifact, it was Queen Puabi's beer straw. This is from approximately the year 2500 BCE. So we're talking about 4,500 years ago. Beer was a favorite drink, but it wasn't brewed in the same way that it is today. And so there was always a lot of junk on the top, and the bottom of the jar was dregs that you didn't want to swallow. And so they devised a way where you could put a straw into it and just drink the middle part, which was the good stuff. And Queen Puabi had a beer straw that was made out of gold, since she was a queen. It was a long thing. I think it's like about 4.5 feet or so in length. But that's my favorite not Babylonian.
So you could recline and...
Right. And there are drawings or carvings of not necessarily Queen Puabi, but other people reclining and drinking beer through their straws. The other story, and I thought Ken in particular would be interested in this, is something you know how sometimes when you're looking for something, you find something completely different that you hadn't expected to find. This is an account I came across of a school, and this is probably from about 1700 BCE in Babylon. And this was a school, again, for young men I don't know what age they would have been, but I'm guessing maybe 12, 13, 14 or so. And it lists the staff of this school. And there's a dean, and there is probably one they would have called a provost or something like that, who is there to keep order. And there are various professors. There's a professor of composition, which is creative writing. There's a professor of mathematics, a professor of geometry, a professor of trigonometry, a professor of classics, which were things that were written before that time, and a professor of religion.
Okay.
And if you think, this is 3,700 years ago.
That's really surprising because, I mean, Europe didn't do that until plus 1100, you know?
Yeah. I mean, you don't have anything in Europe, you know, for, like you say, 11, 1200. The Muslims are a little bit ahead of us on that, us Europeans. But no, even there are several hundred years in which there is nothing comparable to this.
Yeah.
So it makes you remember that these people may not have been so strange after all. You know.
Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting here is the contrast between the different major cultures at this time, because, you know, the one that lasted the longest was Egypt. I mean, they were there forever, it seems like.
I'm sorry?
The culture of the Middle East that lasted the longest at this time was Egypt. And they seemed to be there forever.
Yeah.
But they didn't change. I mean, when you look at the amount of change in, you know, the Hebrews or the Greeks or the Persians or whatever, a lot more than what you see in the Egyptians.
Right. It's essentially a static society for 3,000 years.
Yeah.
There was a period of reform, like with King Tut, right? But then that got put right again, or maybe that's why he died as a boy.
Father, and that was it. You know,
Yeah.
one guy.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book on Egyptian architecture, and you know, there are patterns that emerge before history, in 3,500 BCE, and they're still being used down to the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
So there are some changes in the religion, but it's pretty much surface things.
But you know, this whole exile for the Jews, then that sort of forced them to make changes, I think.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's
they were put in a social situation where they had to adopt or adapt, I should say, to that social situation and its changes, and that, you know, those external pressures are always very interesting to see which way that pushes.
Yeah, well, that's true of almost every individual person too.
Oh yeah. You know. And then as a society, it's the cumulative truth too. The other thing I was wondering about, Richard, you mentioned that there were very few descriptions for some of this as to how the religion changed. But that's you're talking in the Hebrew literature. I'm wondering, is there anything in the Persian literature that would lead us somewhere?
I'm sorry, Ken, is there anything in the Persian religion?
No, not religion, but in the Persian literature to tell us what was happening with the Jews. Or did the Persians were kind of, as I got it, sort of hands off for, I mean,
well, I think that's true. I mean, as far as Judea is concerned, unless there was some kind of a rebellion or a catastrophe like a famine or something, the Persians really didn't get involved very much. And again, there are enormous amount of Persian literature, but they just don't seem to mention this area very much.
They didn't care then. Okay, that's why
Yeah, to them it was you know, what was important was you know, the homeland of Persia, and then where they ran into trouble was places like Egypt and today present day Turkey, and of course their ongoing conflict with the Greeks.
Yeah.
Which did not turn out well for the Persians.
No, sure did, which is amazing. But
anyway, I think it's a fascinating period of history, and I will try and put all this together into booklet form. Probably start work on that after Christmas.
yeah.
So again,